Live from the Washington, D.C. area, it's the Inside Scoop. All the news that our viewers want to know. Now, here's the host.
Welcome to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed, and tonight we are talking about restorative justice in both the classroom and the community. And I have with me tonight Vickie Shoap with the Fairfax County Public School System. She is a restorative justice specialist. And I have Bill Casey, who is a co-coordinator of the Northern Virginia Mediation Services Restorative Justice Program. Thank you both for being here.
You're welcome.
You're welcome.
So I attended a coalition meeting as an invited guest not that long ago and understood that this is actually a coalition that's been working on restorative justice for 10 years. Unbeknownst to me and probably all of our viewers, the idea of restorative justice and how it can be applied, especially where juvenile justice intersects in both the classroom and outside the classroom. Mm-hmm. So, explain what restorative justice is, either one of you.
Okay. Restorative justice really it's a philosophy rather than a program. It's a way of looking at crime and wrongdoing and responding to crime and wrongdoing through a different lens. Where a traditional justice process, I think all of us are used to a traditional justice process where we do an investigation, we figure out, who was responsible, and then the judge orders or creates an agreement or a sentence based on what the law says we should do with the person who committed the offense. Restorative justice looks differently at crime and wrongdoing in that we really look at individual harm and who was really harmed by an incident of wrongdoing or a crime, and how were those persons harmed and impacted. And the process actually brings together people who were harmed and impacted by crime and wrongdoing. So that's the victim, if you will, the person who was harmed, and the person or persons who did the harming. In schools, we do that for all kinds of conflict, whether it's escalating conflict, bringing kids together to talk about what's going on so that we can prevent future violence. We also use the restorative justice process to respond after there's been an incident of wrongdoing, and to allow the people who've been harmed by that process to have some say and some voice in the process of justice and to talk about how they've been harmed. And it really brings to young offenders the reality, that face-to-face accountability and face-to-face conversation that our young kids find difficult to have, to talk to somebody about what you've done and who's been impacted. And then, of course, the ultimate goal of a restorative justice process is to repair the harm and do what we can to make things right. The juvenile offender might offer some things that they can do to make things right, and then the victim will also speak to what their needs are and how they would like to have their needs met in the process.
And it's not a new idea, it's actually quite ancient. So when you look at tribal communities, Native American communities, the fact of the matter is before there was a judge and a jury and it was all about being punitive, it was more about restoring people, it was about dignity. And with children, I think it's about developing empathy. Like, how do you know how someone's been hurt if the focus is only on punishing the offender for what they did?
Right. So in the indigenous communities, before there was ever a legal system, the community itself viewed everyone as an equal part, and when a harm occurred, even if it was by one member of the community, it was a harm to the entire community. And so what they would do is they would gather around in circle, if you will, in community. They would be able to discuss the harm, who's been affected by it, what are the spillover consequences, and then the community at large would decide what was the appropriate way to repair the harm as much as is possible and restore the relationships in the community. And by doing that, they built upon a notion that everybody's connected. But in our modern societies, of course, that doesn't quite translate the same way. But this is not a new age fiction. This is an ancient tradition that we're really beginning to rediscover, particularly in the United States in the last many decades, as well as in other parts of Europe and Asia.
And that's the thing. You talk about a Native American community, they couldn't put them in jail.
Right.
You couldn't separate them from the community. So the person had to live, the person who was harmed had to go on living with the person who'd done the harm.
Right.
And in a school community, I think we've overused suspension. And I think that we're finding that our legislature is addressing that this year, that simply by removing a child, you have not solved the problem by removing them from the community. And the person who was harmed gets nothing by the fact that somebody was removed because they were still harmed.
Right.
You know, so is this a teachable moment, Vickie? I mean, is that what this is about? We keep you hear all the time, teachable moments. Why haven't we recognized, or is it important that we recognize now that we need to be teaching them something?
Absolutely. Restorative justice is an educational process for the student. And I'm strictly speaking, working with students, we work with juveniles, and of course the restorative justice process is used across the nation and across the world, not just with juveniles, with adults as well. Here in Fairfax County, we're really focusing on the use of restorative justice for juveniles, and it's absolutely a teaching process. There's a lot of social emotional skills that our young students are losing as well. The ability to sit and have that conversation and talk about what you did or talk about the harm that you experienced. So that's something really important that's different from the process and really teaches the student. It's a lot easier to sit home for 3-day suspension than to face the person that you harmed, the teacher that you might have, stolen from or were, disrespectful to a teacher. It's easier to sit out a suspension. The other reason suspension really doesn't change behavior is that it's based in isolation, and our students are no longer isolated in the world we live in today. They're usually at home on Facebook or on some other social media, creating even more drama for when they return. The conflict is almost always there when those students return. So removing them from the school for a few days really doesn't solve the ongoing conflict and the escalating conflict. So absolutely, it's an educational process. To be able to sit and have a face-to-face conversation teaches resiliency and teaches our young students that it's okay to make a mistake and you can recover from that and you can still be a contributing citizen. That's what discipline is all about. It means to disciple, to educate. So.
Yeah, and the whole thing, even when we send somebody to jail, the whole point is supposed to be about rehabilitating them to come back to the community. So if we're sending a young person away to sit in front of the computer or the television for 3 days, they come back and they have not been rehabilitated by being isolated. But talk about the stigma of that.
So they carry with them not only the stigma that they personally feel or their family might feel, but they're also labeled then by everyone else in the community, and whether it's the local community or the school community. So in order to try and shift this out of the just punitive model, the notion of restorative justice, as opposed to retributive, focuses on the victim as well as the offender, and then other affected community members, whether they be parents or other teachers in the school. So there are two interests here. One of them, it's a victim-centered process that the needs and the impact of harm on the victim is addressed, which oftentimes isn't in our legal systems, and also on the offender being able to acknowledge, accept responsibility, and contribute in some way to repairing whatever harm has occurred, rather than just go away punished in shame and with stigma, as you suggested in your question.
And it seems to me you're offering both parties the opportunity to be made whole.
Exactly.
Like this failure, none of us are the sum of the worst mistake we ever made. But when you made a mistake, when you make a mistake in kindergarten or third grade, and you're suspended, what does that say going forward if you carry that with you or the trauma of that with you?
Absolutely, but we also know that repeated suspensions in middle school triples the probability that those students will be involved in the juvenile justice system later. We have the U.S. Department of Education, Department of Justice has really good data and research with dropouts, and I think dropout statistics, that's one of the great benefits of restorative justice, is not just the educational piece, but also keeping kids in school, and again, teaching that resiliency that's so important. Making a mistake, as you said, it's important to be able to learn from that and learn how to make things right and learn how to be resilient and recover from that. And I think that's something our kids are losing too, is, sometimes when they make a mistake, especially under zero tolerance, there's these draconian punishments that parents are concerned about, students are concerned about. That's one thing restorative justice aims to resolve as well, is the continued use of suspensions, because we know that increases the likelihood that kids will get into the system. And that shame is one of the reasons. They tend to be labeled when they've been suspended a couple of times, and that can push them down the wrong road when they don't feel like they can have success.
And we talk about zero tolerance policy, which is fairly recent, actually. Discuss a bit about how that has contributed to both where we are punitively with long-term suspensions, but why there's such an opportunity for restorative justice to solve or offer an alternative to that.
So back in the 1980s, probably, the zero tolerance movement really came to the fore, and a lot of it having to do with the drug problem among kids, not only in school, but in the community at large. And while that probably was a useful swing of the pendulum in one way, it went so far to the other side that the kid who was charged with or convicted of a crime, or in the case of a school infraction, serious disciplinary matter, is just again isolated and shamed and labeled in a way in which neither the kid, him or herself, or the parents or the other people that might be affected by it have any chance to come together and try and repair the harm. So zero tolerance takes care of the retributive part of the equation, certainly important, but it doesn't do anything to deal with the restorative part. And whenever that pendulum is so far on the retributive side, we lose all of the other opportunities, whether it's learning, whether it's changing behavior, whether it's dealing with the needs of the people that have been harmed. So it really is a significant paradigm shift to look at offenses or wrongdoing in a much larger context.
And I think the other thing that has come up too is, are we criminalizing children's behavior? I mean, and that's the other thing, when zero tolerance draws a line in the sand about behavior, is it age-appropriate behavior? I mean, kicking a trash can or pointing a pencil and making gun noises, and some of the things that have gotten kids into trouble or suspended, and you're like, back when I was growing up, we called it, acting out, we called it, playing. Anyway, thank you both for being here. Vickie's going to be back in the next segment. You're going to be joining us later. After this break, please come back. We are talking with experts in restorative justice practices here in the Northern Virginia area, and you'll want to tune in to find out more.
For all the papas out there, let's stop what we're doing and take a moment to be with our kids. They can be loud moments, goofy moments, dorky moments. It doesn't really matter. Every time dads take a moment to be with their kids, it's pretty momentous. So let's all take a moment to make a moment today.
Hey, did you know that 2.4 million loving cats and dogs in shelters and rescues need our help to find a home? Go to theshelterpetproject.org and search your local shelters and rescues. Go for a cuddle with your next best friend. Adopt.
Okay, so we drowned the fire, stirred it, drowned it again, and now just feel if it's cold.
Yeah.
Cool.
Smokey just gave me a bear hug.
I know. I already posted it.
We cannot be bystanders.
We can stop to make sure someone is okay.
We can warn someone when their drink isn't safe.
And disrupt the situation.
We can
get someone the cab.
Or walk them home safely.
We can make campuses safer for our friends.
Our roommates.
Our classmates. Our fellow human beings.
We cannot be bystanders.
We can intervene.
It's on us.
All of us.
Learn how and take the pledge at itsonus.org.
When it comes to saving money,
Boss,
what?
Parents!
Don't act like a baby.
Oh, it's like they're having their own little meeting.
This is so humiliating.
Be the boss.
I'm the boss.
What the?
Power nap.
You were saying.
And make a budget.
Let's get to work.
Need a little help?
Stacy, read back the notes.
I can't read. What's it say?
Create a personalized savings plan and get other tools and tips
We can share.
You obviously didn't go to business school.
at feedthepig.org.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. We are talking about restorative justice in both the classroom and in our communities. Joining me is Vickie Shoap. She is with the Fairfax County Public School System as a restorative justice specialist. And in this segment, we also have David Deal, who is from the Northern Virginia Mediation Services Restorative Justice Program as a co-coordinator with Bill Casey. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you.
So what is new to a lot of people has actually been a decade in the making here in Fairfax County. So give us a little bit of background on how that program developed specifically in the public school system.
Fairfax County has made a significant investment in restorative justice, which is really exciting. In 2010, 2011, Fairfax County Public Schools decided to embark on an implementation district-wide of restorative justice in all schools, K through 12. So that's been a very successful implementation. As you know, we have a huge school system with over 200 schools, so we have a real challenge on our hands. My position, the specialist position, was the first position that was hired, and since then we have created a team of 7, which is huge. We're very, very fortunate here in Fairfax County to have positions that are specifically appointed to do restorative justice work. So we're very, very fortunate in Fairfax County. Restorative justice was actually first implemented in Fairfax County Public Schools by Northern Virginia Mediation Service in a few pilot programs. So I would let Dave talk about that.
Yeah, I had no idea that's how it started.
Thanks, Vicki. We started about 9 years ago, I guess. We had a flagship school. High school, big high school. I won't say we experimented out there, but it was we got smoothed out our process.
That was Westfield's?
That was Westfield.
Which was a fairly new high school.
Mm-hmm. And a big high school,
yeah.
Very big, very diverse, a lot of energy, which was good for us. We had a lot of cases, and I think we when Vicki came along, that took us to another whole level. It went countywide, and we've been kind of running ever since. And it's a mature program, as Vicki has described, and it was only with that program where we were able to expand it to include police referrals, not just school referrals. That changed the complexion a fair amount, but the same basic process we've been doing now for 10 years.
And then, the Northern Virginia Mediation Service itself has a very interesting history as an outgrowth of the Center for Conflict Resolution at George Mason University years ago, because I went to George Mason University years ago, and I was familiar with that. And so Northern Virginia Mediation Service has done a lot of very innovative things. And so I'm not surprised to hear that you were a driver in the restorative justice practice, but there are probably people who are familiar with Northern Virginia Mediation Service who don't know that this is part of one of the programs, and it's clearly on the website, that you support and you've been very actively involved in. So again, part of this collaborative effort that involves the police. I was very optimistic when I saw police show up to your quarterly meeting and how positive they are about the program.
Absolutely.
I would add something to that. When we first started dealing with the police, they were kind of cool. The typical policeman, and that includes the SROs in the schools, they sort of saw their job as law enforcement. When somebody does something wrong, we're there to participate in punishment and dealing with that. We have undergone a sea change in the police department. We have, and you saw some of that at the meeting you attended.
I was really surprised.
Yeah.
And that is growing among, I can think of a couple of police stations in particular which handle a lot of our cases where we get a lot of shoplifting cases. And there's a group of policemen who are on a team who work Tyson's Corner. They are so gung-ho. They love to participate. We love to have them because we can talk about law enforcement and what have you, but it's still a bit of an abstraction. I mean, we're keeping them away from juvenile court. They've met the police officer, but without more information, it's still a little blurry, I think. When the police officer comes, and increasingly they like to come, They show up, sometimes in uniform, sometimes not. But to a man, they're not there to wag their finger and threaten people. They're just there to say to the parents, and the parents really appreciate this, we're here to serve you. And what you did was wrong. I have confidence in you. I had confidence in you. That's why I referred you to this program. So we don't need to say it for them. They make such a good impression on the parents. And of course, the parents, in the school system, the kids are facing sometimes suspension, that sort of thing. When we have a police referral, they're facing going to juvenile court with the stigma of having a criminal record, which in years past, colleges would say, have you ever been convicted? Now, typically, colleges say, have you ever been charged? So one strong incentive we have in the police program is to emphasize that if you participate in good faith, and we can talk about the specifics of the process in due course, but if you participate in good faith, you will, the strong incentive is that you will have no criminal record. Well, let me tell you, parents like this, and the kids, they kind of get it, but the parents really get it. And the process is simple. You know, it's nothing magical or unduly complicated. It's a short process. Basically, we have 2 meetings. We meet with all the parties individually. Then we get them, that lasts for about half an hour. Then we get people together, typically all the players, sometimes including a police department or a police officer, and a couple of facilitators, sometimes a store owner or whoever might be the victim. That lasts for about an hour and a half. That's not very long. We cover a lot of ground. 3 basic questions. What happened? Who was impacted and how? And what are you going to do about it? And when I say, what are you going to do about it, we open the floor to the victim. What do you think ought to be done about it? It works pretty well.
It does. So, and to your point too, this gives parents an option. How have you experienced parents being contacted and saying, we want to do this social justice? Do you find that parents are eager to see that avenue, or they're suspicious of that avenue, or what kind of feedback? I mean, it's a big school system.
I think it's mixed. And just parents, just like everyone else in the community, this is different. As Bill Casey said, this is really a new paradigm in looking at justice and discipline. So for parents who are used to confidentiality, for example, discipline is confidential, oftentimes what parents hear when they come home from their child is their child's perspective. And in reality, there's usually 2 sides, 3 sides, 4 sides of a story. Yeah. So parents' initial reaction at first was much more reluctant than it is now. We've done a lot of work in FCPS, parent education. We've done a lot of work to educate parents about what restorative justice is. It sounds a little silly, but it's the same thing we say about getting teachers to participate in the circle, or administrators, or someone who was harmed in a school discipline process, 1 circle at a time. It really is the magic and the power of this process to bring people together just for a simple conversation. Really, the power of the process is what convinces parents to participate. Typically, they're reluctant at first because it is so different.
It's unfamiliar.
It's very unfamiliar. When we call a parent and ask them if they'd like to participate with the other family who's just harmed their child, their initial reaction is not always, yeah, I just can't wait to get there. You know, their initial reaction is, keep that child away from my child. And in reality, 85% of kids are going to be back in the classroom together after an incident. And, so we talk to parents about the possibilities and the realities that your children are probably going to be in the same classroom again, and it's better if we can find a way to help them get along and help them understand and respect each other. So even though there's reluctance initially, parents have been extremely supportive of the process. It is a voluntary process, so I'm not sure if we said that yet, but that's extremely important. If a parent says, I do not want to participate, I don't want my child to participate, then we we don't do restorative justice. Administrators have the student rights and responsibilities, our discipline code. They have a lot of other options, a lot of other tools in their toolbox. We hope that they'll try restorative justice first because there are the outcomes are much better with the restorative justice process. However, it is not appropriate for every situation.
Right.
And it is a voluntary process, and both of those things are extremely important.
And what about just talking about social justice practices in the classroom? You know, getting the kids accustomed to there's a different way to resolve conflict other than, you know, there's a perpetrator, there's a victim, and there's punishment.
It's important, too, that you mention that, because restorative justice is not just, if you think of the higher end of the continuum as a restorative justice process after an incident of harm has occurred or a crime. At the other end of that continuum, before harm has occurred, is the prevention work that we do. And that is teachers being trained in using restorative practices in the classroom so that they can learn to speak more restoratively to students. So rather than saying, you know, what did you do this time? Or you know, what are you here for this time? Or, you know, I get frustrated when I see you talking when I'm trying to teach. We teach them restorative language. Who do you think is being affected by your behavior right now? Those kinds of things. So we teach them to use the restorative language, and we train them to facilitate classroom circles. So they pull kids together in a classroom just to talk about, just to do some relationship building and foster connection in the classroom. And then once the students get used to being in circle and participating, and the students usually love the circle process, they love to talk about themselves, they love to answer those relationship building questions, you know, what's your favorite food and things like that, just to get them used to using the tools, the talking piece and the circle. They love that. And then if there is an incident in the classroom, the teacher can easily pull a circle together to discuss what happened and why it occurred and how we can prevent it from happening again in our classroom. And that classroom becomes a community. Then when there is an incident, because inevitably there will be, those students are ready to participate in a circle process for discipline. They're used to talking and they're used to using the talking piece. And so we're doing that in as many classrooms as we possibly can, train teachers.
And isn't that kind of an empowering thing, Dave, when you teach a community of students and their teacher to solve their problems at the lowest level? Like, we don't need the principal or we don't need the SRO. The fact of the matter is we have the language and the practice to say we know how to handle this before it escalates.
There's no question about it. Vickie has talked about the school situation. Let me switch gears a little bit and talk about the police referrals, because prevention is a big part of that process as well. But it's a little different setting. Take a simple case. Let's say a shoplifter. Often the kids do this in pairs. We go through the what happened, who was affected, and what are you going to do about it? And if goods need to be returned, that goes without saying. Apologies to the store goes without saying. One thing we do that's an important part of our process.
I'm going to ask you to finish your story in the next segment if I can.
Yes, okay.
We're going to break. This is so fascinating. I've gotten completely wrapped up in this. But when we return, we will in fact be hearing from Bill and from Dave, and we'll hear again from Vickie about restorative justice practices in our community as well as in our classroom.
Every time I hear the alarm bell go off in school, I think it's an air raid.
A lot of houses in our neighborhood have been destroyed. I like to close my ears and sing songs whenever the bombs come close.
I'm worried our new neighbors won't like us.
But I know it's all gonna be worth it. I just want my family to be safe. But these are not my words.
These are not my words.
These are not my words.
One day these rats were playing in the woods. Well, it's some matches and that's no good. Listen to smoke before you give it a try. Only you. Don't play with matches. Don't play with fire. Cause there's nothing very funny about rigged out money. Nothing very nice on a homeless mind. So if a gorgeous force is what you desire, don't play with matches. Don't play with fire.
Only you can prevent wildfires.
Fire.
How far would you go to protect the planet?
I want you to build an ark.
Here we go. Okay, that's good. Oh, okay. Ow.
Maybe there's another way.
People, the flood is imminent!
Is it too much to ask for a little precipitation?
Go to fightglobalwarming.com to find out what you and your community can do to reduce global warming pollution.
When it comes to saving money,
What? Parents!
don't act like a baby.
Oh, it's like they're having their own little meeting.
This is so humiliating.
Be the boss.
I'm the boss.
What the?
Power nap.
You were saying.
And make a budget.
Let's get to work.
Need a little help?
Stacy, read back the notes.
I can't read. What's it say?
Create a personalized savings plan and get other tools and tips
We can share.
You obviously didn't go to business school.
at feedthepig.org.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. We are talking about restorative justice this evening in both the classroom and in our community. Joining me in this segment is Bill Casey and Dave Deal. They are co-directors of the Northern Virginia Mediation Service Restorative Justice Program. That is a mouthful.
It is.
So when we went to our break, Dave, you were telling us a story as an example of the kinds of instances in the community where restorative justice is appropriate.
Let me give you a good example. Dealing with juveniles, you're probably not surprised, we handle a lot of shoplifting cases. We have a lot of big shopping centers around here it's like a big candy store for some kids. Anyway, they're often apprehended, and when we go through the process, it's, as I mentioned earlier, our questions are, what happened, who was affected, what are you going to do about it? Well, one thing that we share with the schools is we not only deal with what's happened, the event that's precipitated the case, but it's like, where do you go from here? And in the case of shoplifting, a good example is they will be in a situation, again, where they have to make some decisions. If you live around here and you've been to shopping centers once, you've probably been there, you'll be there again. So we spent some time toward the end of our conference talking about, okay, you've dealt with the past. What are you going to do next time? Let's say you're at a shopping center, you see something you like. Maybe you're with somebody else who says, let's do this. What are you going to do? And it's interesting. It's difficult for the kids to sort of articulate it, but I would say we have a pretty good track record in having them, we focus on very specific things, but it's like, when that thought comes up, what are you going to say? No. If the person you're with says, oh, let's do it anyway, what are you going to do? And the kids routinely say, well, and often with the help of their parents, I'll leave. Well, that to us is victory.
That brings up something, that is making a plan. I read something about this somewhere where it's not that young people don't know the right thing to do, don't drink beer, don't smoke. It's that they don't have a plan for when they're confronted, and they get carried along because they never thought to themselves, what will I do if X, Y, or Z happens?
Right.
So this fits right in with that, exactly so it's not just restoring the person who's been harmed, but you're basically saying now you need to make a plan.
Right, and one of the things that helps them appreciate that is the focus in the restorative justice process on the needs and of the victim. Because often we've talked a lot, appropriately so, about the offender, the juvenile, and how this can benefit him or her. But the primary focus of a restorative justice process is the victim. Now, in the shoplifting cases, which are predominant, the victim is a store. So sometimes the juvenile will say, well, what's the big deal if I take this from Macy's or I take it from JCPenney or whatever? And what they don't have any appreciation for until they hear from a representative of those stores, what happens when a person steals even one item? It may only be, $50 or $100. But when you add up all of those costs, the losses to a victim's store, for example, it becomes a huge problem. And not only that, but the stores have to employ loss prevention officers, security people, in-store television networks in order to be able to monitor this. And when they confront a kid who has shoplifted outside the store, once they've passed the last point where they could pay, they don't know how that kid is going to react. And so there's a lot of stress for a victim that has to go through this on a regular basis. And ultimately, they can't risk raising their prices to compensate for it, because then they'll lose out in competition. So the impact is then on the workers in the store, and whose hours are cut or who is laid off. And most kids and their parents, frankly, when they hear this from a store representative, are really astonished. And so the part of the getting a plan for the future is influenced by an appreciation for what has happened to the victim and what has been the real harm. And what would I do the next time if I appreciate now what some of the consequences are.
Right, so we talk sometimes, and I think it's overused, victimless crimes. Well, there's never really a victimless crime, right? It's just like the victim might be a store, but that store impacts the lives of everybody that works there. And so I think it's important that you bring clarity to that. Tell me, too, about the fact that you can't have had a previous, if I'm correct, you can't have previously engaged with the juvenile justice system in order to be eligible for this particular track. Is that correct?
That's right. That's a pretty common precondition in the restorative justice processes. It's a starting point. Now, as a purist, we would say that shouldn't be there. But in order to get a program going, you need to convince policymakers. And for first offenders only, that is really a paramount stake you put in the ground to say, this isn't for everyone, this is for kids who are willing and able and deserve it. Well, a lot of other kids deserve it too. But as a starter, that for first offenders only, that is really important. And we'll be doing that in Fairfax for quite a while, I think.
So what kinds of, so we're talking about young people, what kinds of theft, vandalism, property damage?
Right, all of those are common offenses, particularly in this area in both the Tyson's Corner Mall and the Springfield Town Center, which are the two largest parts in Northern Virginia. But it's also, it could be an assault between juveniles on the street. It could be trespassing, it could be defacing property, it could be any number of crimes where we're not talking about obviously capital offenses, but where there's a true victim and where there's a true offender who has recognized and is willing to acknowledge their personal participation in it, in which the needs of all of those parties, including the parents, who are often secondary victims in this in this process. And Dave and I and Vickie all see the effects of a parent who has come into one of these conferences or circles and has to acknowledge that their own child violated not only the law or the discipline code, but the very values that they've been trying to teach. And it's sometimes a bit heartbreaking to hear a parent talk about what this impact has been on the family's reputation, either in the community or in their church or in the school environment. And it's quite powerful, yet another influence on this juvenile to make the plan and to be influenced to make the plan.
Let me just build on that. The parents are a key role in the process. And we laid on pretty thick saying, this is mostly about the kids here. They're going to do most of the talking up front, but you have an important role. And when it gets to talking about impact, I must say I was expecting parents to be sort of circle the wagons and very defensive. Mm-hmm. That has not been the case. It's never been the case for the school cases or now the police cases. And the other thing I would say is there is often some anger from the parents. Mm-hmm. But I would say what predominates is they feel shamed. Mm-hmm. And they feel sorry that their child, because they've done this, is leaning in the wrong direction. Their future is ahead of them. So the parents are really, we don't have to speak for the parents. The parents lay it on pretty thick about how we are embarrassed, we're shamed, but most important, do you see what you're doing with your future? Here is, you have a get out of jail free card right here. take it and go with it.
You know, and I think, and again, it comes back to teachable moments. What is the whole point of trying to help children grow into adults if all you're going to do is punish them for mistakes, but never tell them how to make it right and practice how to make it right, and accept the fact that you know, we all have made poor judgments. The difference is we made them back in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, where they didn't have security cameras and technology. I mean, I just deny everything at high school reunions, right? Don't you guys? It's kind of like, I don't know what you're talking about. I can't remember. No, I don't think I was there.
Yeah.
And it's very different for a lot of different reasons. And so I go back to, are we criminalizing childhood behavior? And if we are trying to get them on the right track, it seems to me that what you're doing makes the greatest impact. And the fact that police have embraced this, I mean, I'm looking at your caseload numbers. This has to be one of the greatest indicators that this is being successful, because all those cases you have mean it's not in the juvenile justice system, it's not in the court system.
The police officers, once resistant, are increasingly loving it. Now, there's an important part of the process we haven't talked about, I'll just mention it. We have this process where there's a lot of talking back and forth, but this isn't just a talking session. At the end of our process, what is required is there's an agreement. It's a written agreement, which is reached by the offenders and with our assistance, but it's really, we believe in self-determination. It's between the offenders and the victims to work out something. It could be apologies, it could be restitution, it could be community service. It's written down. I've asked this question several times to the adolescents and their parents. Have they ever signed anything like this before? Well, what 16-year-old kid has ever signed an agreement? This is a big deal. We only have in the agreement things that all the participants have agreed to, and they sign it. And Bill and I monitor it. And if they fail to do it, game's over. They go back to juvenile court. So that agreement is a key stopper. It's not just a hand-holding session. This is pretty intense.
Well, you need to impress upon them that there's responsibility and also consequences.
They walk away with something in writing which says that they have agreed to. Now, some of the stuff they've done is at the session, maybe an apology or writing a check or something, but often it's community service. And it also includes, next time, what do I do faced with this situation? That's in the agreement going forward.
And that is so important, like I said, to make a plan once you've been in trouble, to have the forethought that you could easily do this again if you're not, if you didn't make a plan. Well, you guys don't look particularly scary. So I don't know, if you've got a high recidivism rate or...
Well, that's the beauty of this. The data so far, which is largely since June 1st of 2017, when it became an official police policy. But the early indications are that the recidivism rate among these first-time juvenile offenders is probably 4 to 5%. Among people who are in the general court system, it's probably 40% or more, because you have a lot of repeat offenders. So
that's amazing. 4 to 5% versus 40%.
Yeah.
You guys are doing something right. Please join us after this break. We are going to come back for the final segment, talking about restorative justice here in Northern Virginia.
So, same time next week?
Well, of course.
Put away a few bucks, feel like $1 million. For free tips to help you save, go to Feed the Pig.
I dare you. I dare you to change the world. Yeah, you. Getting that college education. I dare you to be somebody important. Like be a teacher. Or a reality TV star. I dare you to stand up here. To call the shots. To be a role model.
An inspiration. An innovator.
To be a teacher.
Think you can change my life?
Make me excited about science like you. Have a career that really means something? Then do it. I dare you.
They say you don't have to be so strong, but this is my mother, my purpose. Strength is not optional. See, I lift her now like she raised me then, so I know my strength is super, but I'm still human.
Oh, look who's here.
We're back to the Inside Scoop. Here again, your host.
Welcome back to Inside Scoop. I'm your host, Catherine Reed. Tonight we're talking about restorative justice in both the classroom and in our community. Joining me in this final segment is Vickie Shoap of the Fairfax County Public School System. She's a restorative justice specialist. And Dave Deal, who is one of the co-directors of the NVMS Restorative Justice Program. Thank you both for being here. So we had a call from Martin in Manassas who actually wanted to know, how do you track these metrics? I mean, we mentioned this recidivism rate in the last segment. How are you tracking that? What is the data? And how are you making that available, or what impact does it have on policy?
It depends on, I think it's important to clarify that we've kind of been talking about two different programs. If you really look at the restorative justice umbrella in Fairfax County, we have the Fairfax County Public Schools Restorative Justice Initiative, where we're using restorative justice both, again, to teach those practices in the classroom, but also to do interventions once there's been an incident in lieu of suspension, or sometimes in combination with suspension, depending on the discretion of the administrator. So there's the restorative justice program in FCPS, and then there's the alternative accountability program, which is the AAP program that we've been talking about. That is a collaborative program of 6 agencies in Fairfax County. So Fairfax County Public Schools, Northern Virginia Mediation Service, Fairfax County Police, Fairfax County Juvenile Court, Neighborhood and Community Services. And so those agencies work together on this collaborative program, and that effort's been underway for 3 or 4 years now. And that is for criminal charges. So in other words, there's restorative justice for discipline at the school level, and then at the criminal justice level, that's the AAP program for first-time offenders.
Well, that's a very important distinction, because you're right, we have been talking about two different things, but we didn't name what you're doing in the community as the alternative accountability program.
Exactly. So the way we track recidivism and the way we keep data in the school system is we keep data on every circle that we do, every time we do an intervention. My staff does a lot of data entry. They enter every circle. They enter every person who participated in that circle. We keep every referral that comes from a school. So we are able to track students throughout the school year, and our recidivism has been completely awesome. I have to say we're very proud of our data. We have a much lower recidivism rate than suspension and traditional discipline. So that's something that's exciting. The other data that's coming out of restorative justice, though, are a lot of those intangible things, a lot of those anecdotal things. You know, where kids are asking, "Can you send that lady back again to do a circle rather than getting into a fight?" Or they'll ask for a conflict resolution process. They'll ask for a circle. So there's some great outcomes that are happening that you really can't point to specific data. Although we are collecting our data and we do have some good data on recidivism, also the number of schools participating. When we started, we had just a few schools. Now we have restorative justice happening at all the middle and high schools and many of the elementary schools in Fairfax County. So that's some important information too. So the way we track data through the AAP program is done through the police department. They track reoffense for us and then give us that information.
So is one of the outcomes that you hope for, Dave, is that when you introduce this through the AAP program in the classroom, that you will eventually be raising a generation of young people who look at conflict differently and have a different set of skills because they had a different set of experiences?
Oh, I think so. That is just embedded deeply in everything we do. For instance, I'll just give you an example. In a shoplifting case, you know, we often get restitution if the goods haven't already been recovered. We often get apologies. But what I've heard store owners ask for is saying, what I really want from you, I would like you to be a customer, a member of the public who respects me because I want to respect you. So that's a heavy emphasis on where do we go from here, and in order to be a good citizen.
Yeah.
Here's what you need to do. Here's what you should not do. Let's focus on where you go from here. So we have a pretty heavy emphasis on where do we go from here and how to do the right thing from now on.
Do you think at some point you'll do surveys? You've been at this for about 8 years or so in the schools, and you've been at this for a while with the AAP program. At some point in the future, will you do surveys to kind of see, again, not just from a data metric as far as recidivism, like they didn't get in trouble, but how it really impacted the rest of their school career, how it impacted the outcome as adults?
We have a cherry waiting to be picked by serious researchers. I mean, we are ourselves, I think, serious researchers, but we're not university researchers. We have made a special effort. NVMS, in fact, let me backstep a bit. NVMS, among the groups participating, we're the lone nonprofit. We are the hub. We have the confidence of the agencies, the other agencies. Every one of our cases goes to NVMS and is logged in. So we have an elaborate file. We've developed a pretty fine-grained database. And the AAP program is relatively new, so we're dancing as fast as we can right now. But the police have a high motivation in keeping an eye on recidivism, and the early reports is pretty good, far lower than expected. So over time, I think we have the cherry waiting to be picked. I think is for some serious researchers with a couple years of data. We have a lot of data, and I think we'll show some stuff which is pretty impressive.
Yeah, doing follow-up. I think that would be the most interesting thing, not just that you stayed out of trouble, but 5, 10, 15 years down the road, somebody could look back and say it was pivotal, it was a turning point. Somebody gave me an opportunity to do it differently, to make it right, and to go forward not making the same mistake again.
You can see we need to be patient. Those kinds of stories, people need to have a little life experience before they reflect on what happened when they were a teenager. But we're eager to get our hands on that kind of stuff.
I think it will be difficult, though. I think one of the things about restorative justice is, although as you said, it's not new, it's not a new flavor of the month, it's been happening around the country for a long time, is that whenever you have a new program in a county that is as successful as this is, it's compared to a lot of other models that we would not track juveniles into their 20s to see if juvenile court was effective in changing their behavior. So I think sometimes with a new program, we're subjected to a lot of research that wouldn't be done for other programs. So for example, it's very hard for us to say whether or not restorative justice alone is reducing suspensions in Fairfax County Public Schools because we have so many different interventions. We're so lucky and fortunate that we have so many programs to help kids. So it's hard to separate that out and say that this program alone we know as practitioners that we're reducing suspensions, but there is a lot of intervention programs in Fairfax County. Again, we're very fortunate. It's very hard though to pull out one program. So that is a challenge that we have in tracking outcomes and looking at outcomes.
So what do you think going forward? You said, it's in each school, but I'm sure each school embraces it differently. It's not on all your elementary schools, I know, because I interviewed 8 elementary school teachers for the Grant Involved program, and I just brought up community schools, my favorite topic, and and restorative justice, just to kind of get a testing of the waters. And it was all over the map, just with 8 of them. So I'm assuming that probably it's all over the map in the county.
That's right. Well, we have, like I said, over 245 schools and centers, and the restorative justice team is a team of 7. So it's a big challenge. And again, we're lucky to have those 7 positions, but it's a big challenge. So right now what we do, restorative practices, the underlying theory behind restorative practices and restorative justice is that people are more likely to make positive changes if you do things with them rather than to and for them. And that's the basic premise of restorative justice. So we work with schools. Everything we do is based in those principles. We work with schools where we are invited in, schools that may be ready for an implementation. Maybe some schools are dealing with something else that they're implementing that year, and maybe we'll be there next year. However, restorative justice is available at all schools for discipline. My staff, the central office staff, will go in and facilitate if no one is trained in that building. So we have different levels of trained staff in different buildings. In some buildings, there are more people that are trained than others, and it's really simply a matter of resources and us being able to train as many people as possible at a time. It really is resources. So we're working on staff at each school being trained to do restorative justice practices within their school building. In the meantime, we have the schools have the support of the central office team to come in and do restorative justice. Then we also have the backup of Northern Virginia Mediation Service. We have a contract with them, and if my staff gets really overwhelmed, we can rely on them to come in and help us. So we haven't had to turn down any processes yet. When an administrator has called us in, we haven't gotten to the point where we can't respond to requests, but our goal is to get people trained so that schools can do their own process, and we're working on that.
And what about your scaling? You as the lone nonprofit in this coalition, how do you scale? And I know that you, and because I found them all online, you and Dave have your own show. I mean, you've spoken, there are things out there from 5 years ago where you've given presentations, you've spoken at conferences. Where do you go from here to make this more widely accepted?
Well, we're pretty active on the outreach side. We've participated in kind of local groups. The Ethics Society has had us come a couple of times. At least one church I can think of has had us come. Both Bill and I and other people at NVMS are involved in a group called the IIRP, International Institute of Restorative Practices.
Okay.
We have participated there, not just by showing up and talking, but doing thoughtful papers, what I think were thoughtful papers, dealing with all kinds of things. So we are definitely wired into what is a very large community. Let me be clear here. This is not a very unusual thing that's going on. There are hundreds of communities around the nation who are using restorative justice in different ways. Right. We are embedded deeply in that overall behavior, which includes a lot of other nations,
right?
Especially Australia, New Zealand. Mm-hmm. So. We like doing it. It's fun. It's good for us. We learn from other people, and also how better to learn than to explain something about what you're doing. It gives you a lot of your own insight. So we like it, doing that. And we're contacted fairly often by people to, maybe just with questions, a little bit of consulting, but a lot of times it's to participate.
Well, and I can appreciate that, because that's how people learn, is being exposed and being coached and mentored and guided all along the way. And I so appreciate both of you being here. This has been a wonderful show, and Bill, you have, I think, enlightened people who may have heard the word, not understood that it is a practice, and not just an idea. And so I hope you'll come back again. I look forward actually to doing a series of these shows if you guys are up for it.
We are up for it.
Up for it. You heard it here, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be doing a series on restorative justice and how we can apply it in our communities as well as in our classrooms. Thanks so much for joining us tonight on Inside Scoop.